The soldiers searched the farmhouse for 3 hours, while Jake and Lyra waited in the darkness of the storm cellar, and she taught him how to quiet his mind so her telepathic abilities would not overwhelm him. She explained that her species communicated through touch and energy, and that humans were surprisingly compatible with their neural networks, which was one reason her father had sent her specifically. Jake learned that Lyra was not just a princess but also their greatest scientist who had studied human broadcasts and signals for 50 Earth years, though she was over 200 years old herself. In her world, time moved differently, and her people lived for thousands of years, which made relations with shorter-lived species challenging. But humans fascinated them with their intensity and passion. The sound of boots directly above them made them both freeze, and Jake held his breath while dust fell from the ceiling boards. But the lead lining worked, and the scanners found nothing. After another hour, the sounds faded, and Jake carefully opened the cellar door to peek out, finding his farm deserted except for tire tracks and boot prints everywhere in the dirt. They emerged into the night, and Jake saw that the soldiers had taken samples from the crash site, but left most of the wreckage behind, probably planning to return with better equipment. In daylight, Lyra walked to the twisted metal and placed her hands on a section that looked like a control panel, and it lit up with symbols that hurt to look at directly, like they existed in more dimensions than 3. She pulled out a small device about the size of a phone, but made of that same shifting metal, and began taking pieces from the wreckage that seemed important, though Jake could not tell why. "We need to leave this place before they return," she said, and Jake agreed, but he had no idea where they could go, that the government would not find them eventually. He remembered his old Marine buddy Tom, who lived completely off-grid in the mountains of Colorado and had always been paranoid about government surveillance even before this happened. Jake led Lyra to his workshop where he kept his grandfather's old truck that looked like rust held together by prayer but had an engine he had rebuilt twice and would run forever. As they loaded supplies, Lyra touched the truck and her eyes widened as she said, "This vehicle has soul and memory," and she could feel the generations of Jake's family who had driven it. They drove through the night, avoiding main roads and staying on backcountry paths Jake had learned as a teenager, when he would sneak out to meet girls and race cars. Lyra sat beside him, watching the landscape pass with wonder, and occasionally pointing at things like cows or windmills that she had only seen in human transmissions but never in reality. She asked him about human concepts like love and family and friendship, which her people understood intellectually, but did not experience the same way with their purely logical minds. Jake tried to explain how humans could do irrational things for love, and she touched his hand on the steering wheel, flooding him with her confusion and curiosity about these emotions. He felt her loneliness too, and learned that being royal meant she had never had real friends, only subjects and tutors and guards who treated her as something separate and untouchable. They stopped for gas at a station so old it still had mechanical pumps, and Jake went inside to pay, while Lyra waited in the truck with a baseball cap covering her glowing hair. The old man behind the counter looked at Jake strangely and said the news was reporting some kind of chemical spill in Kansas and military roadblocks everywhere, so folks should be careful traveling. Jake thanked him and bought extra supplies, including maps of the back roads through 3 states and enough food and water for several days of driving without stopping. When he got back to the truck, Lyra was crying purple tears that crystallized as they fell, and she showed him through their connection that she had received a transmission from her ship. Her rescue beacon was damaged and would take days to repair. And worse, her enemies had sent Hunter ships to ensure she never made it home alive to report her findings. Jake started the truck and drove faster, knowing that alien assassins were now added to their problems along with the Earth military and probably every intelligence agency on the planet. They drove through the rest of the night and into the morning while Lyra used her device to scan for threats and taught Jake words in her language that sounded like singing. She told him about her 3 hearts and how they each served different purposes, one for life, one for thought, and one for what her people called the eternal spark. Jake asked what the eternal spark was, and she turned that purple color again and said it was what humans called the soul, but more real and measurable in her species. They stopped at an abandoned rest area so Jake could sleep for a few hours, and Lyra stood guard using senses that could detect movement and heat from miles away. When he woke, she was sitting beside him in the truck cab, studying his face. And she said humans are beautiful in their imperfection and variety, unlike her people who all looked similar. Jake laughed and said she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and her skin shifted through 3 colors before settling on purple, as she processed the compliment. They continued driving through Nebraska and into Colorado, as the landscape changed from flat plains to rolling hills, and finally, to the mountains. Jake remembered from his marine training Tom's place was so far off, any map that even GPS did not show the road, and Jake had to navigate by memory and landmarks like a specific twisted pine tree and a rock that looked like a bear. The final approach was a dirt trail, so rough that even the old truck struggled, and Lyra had to use her strength, which was greater than any human, to help push when they got stuck. When they finally arrived at the cabin, Tom was standing on the porch with a shotgun until he recognized Jake, and then his face split into a huge grin. "Jake, my brother, what brings you to my mountain and who is the lady?" Tom asked and then stopped mid-sentence as Lyra removed her cap, and her alien nature became obvious. Tom dropped his shotgun and stared, and Jake quickly explained everything while Tom's expression went from shock to disbelief to a strange kind of acceptance. Well, Tom finally said, "I always knew the government was hiding aliens, and now you brought me one who needs help. So I guess we better figure this out together." He invited them inside his cabin, which was powered by solar panels and had its own water supply and enough stored food for years, because Tom had always prepared for the apocalypse. Lyra scanned the cabin with her device and said it was undetectable to most technology, and Tom laughed, saying that was the point of living so far from civilization. They spent the rest of the day planning, while Lyra worked on repairing her beacon using parts from Tom's extensive electronics collection, mixed with pieces from her crashed ship. Tom turned out to be surprisingly helpful, having spent years studying conspiracy theories about aliens and having technical knowledge from his time in military intelligence. As night fell, Lyra showed them both a projection from her device of her homeworld with its 3 suns and floating cities, and explained the political situation that led to her mission. Her father wanted peace, but the military faction led by General Vox wanted to conquer Earth and take its resources, especially water, which was rare in their system. She had volunteered for this mission to prove that humans were worth saving and joining as equals. But now, with her ship destroyed, she had no way to send that message. Jake took her hand and promised they would find a way. And through their connection, she felt his determination and something else that her people had no word for, but humans called hope. The night sky over Kansas cracked open like an egg, and fire poured through the break while Jake Miller sat on his porch drinking coffee and watching what he thought was just another meteor shower until the burning object changed direction 3 times. Jake dropped his mug and it shattered on the wooden floor as he watched the thing slam into his wheat field about half a mile from his farmhouse, sending up dirt and flames that lit up the darkness like daylight. Without thinking, he grabbed his toolbox and the military first aid kit from his truck and ran toward the crash site with his boots pounding the dry ground and his heart racing, because this was no meteor. The closer he got, the more he could see that this was a ship made of some metal that shifted colors from silver to gold to blue, and it was broken in half with strange purple fire eating at the edges. Through the smoke, he heard a sound like crying, but not quite human, and he covered his face with his shirt and pushed forward into the heat until he saw her trapped under a beam of that strange metal. She was the most beautiful and terrifying thing he had ever seen, with skin that seemed to be made of liquid sapphire, and hair so white it glowed, and she was looking at him with eyes like molten silver. Jake grabbed the beam and pulled with all his strength, and even though it burned his hands through his work gloves, he managed to lift it enough for her to crawl out from under the wreckage. She tried to stand, but fell, and he caught her noticing that she was taller than him by at least a foot, and her blood was purple and glowing slightly where it dripped from a cut on her forehead. He carried her away from the burning ship just as something inside exploded, and they both hit the ground hard, with Jake shielding her body with his own, as debris rained down around them. When the explosion settled, she was looking at him with those impossible eyes, and her mouth moved, but the sounds that came out were like music mixed with static until a device on her wrist sparked, and suddenly he heard English. "Thank you, human. You saved my life," she said, and her voice was like nothing he had ever heard before, with layers and harmonies that made his chest feel warm and strange. Jake helped her stand and noticed her skin was changing from blue to a soft purple color wherever he touched her, and she pulled back slightly with what looked like embarrassment on her alien features. "My name is Jake Miller, and you crashed on my farm, so let's get you somewhere safe before the government shows up." "Because that explosion was visible for miles," he said, trying to stay calm. She nodded and said, "My designation is Princess Lyra of the Andromedan Royal House, and my ship was sabotaged by enemies who do not want peace between our peoples and yours." They started walking toward his farmhouse with Lyra limping and leaning on him for support, and Jake noticed that she weighed less than she should for her size, as if her bones were hollow like a bird's. Inside his kitchen, he sat her at the table and got his first aid supplies while she looked around at everything with curiosity, touching the wooden table and the ceramic salt shaker. With wonder. "Your dwelling is primitive, but pleasant," she said, and then covered her mouth with one elegant six-fingered hand and added, "I apologize, that was rude. My translator is still calibrating." Jake laughed and said, "No offense. Taking my place is pretty basic, but it works," and he started cleaning the cut on her forehead with antiseptic, while she studied his face intently. When the cotton touched her wound, her purple blood crystallized instantly and fell off like tiny gems, and underneath her skin was already healing itself at an impossible speed. She explained that her species healed quickly but needed certain minerals to maintain their energy, and without them she would weaken over the next few hours until she could not maintain solid form. Jake remembered his rock collection in the barn from his geology hobby days and asked if earth minerals would work, and her eyes lit up with hope as she said they might if the atomic structure was similar. He helped her to the barn where he had shelves full of specimens he had collected over 20 years, and she held her hand over them until she stopped at a chunk of raw amethyst. The purple crystal started glowing in her hand, and she absorbed the energy through her skin, which turned a healthy blue again, while Jake watched in amazement as her injuries completely healed. She smiled at him, and for the first time he noticed that her teeth were like pearls, and when she smiled her whole face seemed to light up from within with a soft bioluminescent glow. Jake heard helicopters in the distance and knew they had maybe 10 minutes before the military arrived and searched every building, so he made a quick decision that would change his life forever. "Follow me. I have a place they won't find," he said, and led her to the storm cellar his grandfather had built in the 1950s with walls lined with lead that would block any scanning equipment down in the cellar by the light of an old camping lantern. Lyra told him why she had really come to Earth, and it was not just as an ambassador but as a test subject. Her father, the king, wanted to know if humans and Andromedans could coexist peacefully, and possibly even create alliance bonds, which in her culture meant something deeper than friendship. But not quite. Marriage, Jake asked. What made her think humans were ready for contact with alien life when they could barely stop fighting among themselves? And she touched his hand gently with hers. The moment their skin made contact, Jake felt a jolt like electricity, but warm, and suddenly he could feel her emotions as clearly as his own, and they were a mixture of fear, hope, and something else, you see. She said, "Your species has something. Mine lost long ago, which is the ability to feel deeply and act on instinct, rather than pure logic, and that may save both our civilizations." The helicopters were directly overhead now, and Jake could hear trucks pulling up to his farmhouse and soldiers shouting orders to search every building and establish a perimeter. Turned off the lantern, and they sat in complete darkness while Lyra explained that her people had been watching Earth for centuries, waiting for the right moment to make contact. But there were factions on her world who believed humans were too violent and primitive to join the galactic community, and they had tried to stop her mission by destroying her ship. Jake felt her shiver in the dark, and without thinking, he put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, her skin warm and smooth and strange under his touch. "Hey, sweetie, you are safe now. I will protect you," he whispered, and felt her skin change to that purple color again, even in the darkness, as she replied with a voice full of emotion. "Yes, darling," she said, and he could feel through their connection that these earth terms of endearment meant something profound to her because her people did not use such intimate language. On the third day at Tom's cabin, the hunter ships found them, and Lyra woke Jake at dawn with her hand over his mouth and terror in her silver eyes as she whispered, "They are here." Through the window they could see nothing but Lyra's senses detected. 3 ships hovering invisible above the forest, and 12 Andromedan soldiers moving through the trees toward the cabin. Tom was already at his hidden weapons cache, pulling out things Jake did not even know were legal to own, while muttering about how he knew this day would come eventually. Lyra stood in the center of the room and her skin began to glow bright blue as she prepared to fight. But Jake could feel through their connection that she was terrified. These were elite warriors from her own world, trained from birth to kill, and she was a scientist and diplomat who had basic combat training, but nothing compared to them. Jake remembered his Marine training and took command, telling Tom to set up defensive positions while he and Lyra would try to negotiate, since killing her own people would destroy any chance of peace. They stepped out onto the porch, and 12 figures materialized from thin air, wearing armor that looked like liquid metal and holding weapons that hummed with energy. The leader removed his helmet, revealing features similar to Lyra, but masculine, with silver skin and black eyes, and he spoke in their language, which the translator converted. "Princess Lyra, you are commanded to return home for trial as a traitor who revealed our location to a primitive species and violated the secrecy laws of our people." Lyra stood tall and replied that she was following the king's direct orders and that General Vox had no authority over a royal mission. But the warrior laughed. "Your father has been placed under house arrest, and General Vox now controls the council, and he has decreed that Earth must be conquered before humans become a threat." Jake stepped forward and said, "If you want her, you go through me." And the warrior looked at him with contempt, saying, "Humans were insects compared to Andromedans." Tom chose that moment to demonstrate human ingenuity by detonating the charges he had placed around the perimeter, which did not hurt the shielded warriors but confused their sensors. In the chaos, Jake grabbed Lyra, and they ran to the old mine shaft Tom had shown them, which went deep into the mountain and had dozens of tunnels and chambers. The warriors followed, but their advanced technology was less useful. In the tight rocky passages where Jake's knowledge of Earth combat and Tom's prepared traps gave them advantages, they moved deeper into the mountain while Tom stayed behind to slow the pursuers with improvised explosives and his knowledge of every tunnel and dead end in the system. Lyra led Jake to a chamber with an underground lake, and she pulled him into the water, which was freezing cold, but she said would mask their heat signatures from the scanners. They floated in the darkness, holding each other while they heard the warriors searching nearby, and Jake felt Lyra's 3 hearts beating against his chest in a rhythm like a song. She whispered that if they were caught, she wanted him to know that these 5 days with him had shown her more about life than her previous 2 centuries of existence. Jake kissed her then, and their minds merged completely, and he saw her entire life, the palace made of crystal, the loneliness of being different even among her own kind. He shared his memories too of his parents dying when he was young, of joining the Marines to find purpose, of coming home to an empty farm and looking at stars. They understood each other completely in that moment. 2 souls from different worlds finding something neither had known they were looking for until they found it. The water around them began to glow as Lyra's emotions affected her bioluminescence, and she quickly suppressed it, but not before one warrior spotted the light. They surfaced and ran deeper into the caves while energy blasts scorched the walls behind them, and Jake realized they were being herded toward a dead end. At the final chamber, they turned to make their stand, and Lyra began to glow brighter than Jake had ever seen her as she prepared to use her full power. But before the warriors could attack, Tom appeared from a hidden passage and threw something that looked like a road flare but exploded with an electromagnetic pulse. The warriors' armor flickered and failed, and suddenly, they were just tall humanoid beings without their technological advantages, facing 3 determined defenders. The fight was brutal, and Jake took several hits that burned through his clothes and skin, but he kept fighting with the fury that had earned him medals in Afghanistan. Tom fought like the paranoid survivalist. He was using every dirty trick and improvised weapon, while Lyra used her superior strength and speed to protect them both. When it was over, 8 warriors were unconscious, and 4 had retreated to their ships, and Lyra stood over the leader, who was her own cousin. She now revealed Prince Zeth had always been jealous of her position as heir and had allied with General Vox to remove her, but now he was defeated and dishonored. Lyra touched his forehead and sent a message through their neural link to her father, the king, showing him everything that had happened. And Vox's betrayal, Zeth's eyes widened as he realized the king had never been arrested, and this had all been a test and trap that Vox had fallen into perfectly. The remaining warriors received new orders through their implants and immediately knelt to Lyra, asking forgiveness for following false commands from a traitor general. Tom looked at the unconscious aliens, and then at Jake's injuries and said they needed a hospital. But Lyra placed her hands on Jake's wounds. She sang something in her language, and her hands glowed, and Jake felt the pain disappear as his flesh knitted back together, leaving only faint, silver scars. The lead warrior gave Lyra a communication device, and she spoke to her father, who revealed that he had suspected Vox's betrayal and used Lyra's mission to expose it. The king had allowed the hunter ships to leave, knowing that Lyra would survive with human help, and that this would prove humanity's worthiness as allies. But now came the real challenge, because the Earth governments had detected the battle, and satellites showed military forces converging on their location from all directions. Lyra made a decision that would change everything, and told her father to bring the fleet to Earth now and make open contact before the situation escalated. Within minutes, massive ships appeared in the skies over every major Earth city, and Lyra's father's voice was broadcast in every language calling for peaceful dialogue. The president and other world leaders had no choice but to acknowledge the alien presence and agree to negotiations, with Lyra serving as the bridge between worlds. Jake stood beside her as she prepared to address the United Nations, and she took his hand, sending him courage through their connection, while he gave her his human strength. Tom watched from the cabin as his two friends prepared to change history, and he laughed, thinking how his crazy preparations had actually helped save two civilizations. Before they left for New York, Lyra turned to Jake and said, "Whatever happens next, I want you to know that meeting you was worth everything, even if it cost me my throne." Jake pulled her close and said, "Hey, sweetie, we are in this together now," and she glowed that purple color and replied, "Yes, darling, and I would have it no other way." The United Nations Assembly Hall had never been so quiet as when Princess Lyra walked in, wearing her royal robes that seemed to be made of starlight, with Jake beside her in his marine dress uniform. Every eye followed them as they approached the podium where the Secretary General waited, looking pale and overwhelmed by the events of the last 48 hours. Outside the building, 5 Andromedan ships hovered silently, while human military forces surrounded them in a tense standoff that could explode into war at any moment. Lyra touched the microphone, and it adapted to her voice as she began to speak in perfect English, though her words carried harmonics that made everyone listen with complete attention. "People of Earth, I come before you not as conqueror, but as friend. And I bring greetings from the Andromedan Empire, which has watched your species grow and struggle and achieve." She explained that humanity was at a crossroads where they could join a community of 1,000 worlds, or remain isolated and eventually face hostile species without allies. The Russian ambassador interrupted, demanding to know why they should trust beings who had spied on Earth for centuries and could destroy them with their superior technology. Jake stepped forward and told his story of finding Lyra and fighting beside her, and how she had risked everything to protect humanity from those who wanted Earth enslaved. The Chinese representative asked what the Andromedans wanted in return, and Lyra's father appeared as a hologram towering 20 feet tall but with kind eyes. "We want partners, not subjects." The king said and explained that humans had something unique, which was their ability to innovate and adapt faster than any species they had encountered. The discussions went on for hours, with breaks for leaders to consult their governments and military advisors, while Jake and Lyra waited in a secure room. She was exhausted from maintaining her composure, and he held her while she cried, purple tears of stress and fear that she was failing in her mission. Tom had somehow talked his way into the building, claiming to be Jake's advisor, and he brought them food and news from outside where crowds were gathering. Half the people were terrified and wanted the aliens gone, while others welcomed them with signs saying, "We are not alone," and seeing it as the next step in human evolution. The Pope had declared that God's creation was vast enough for all life, and Muslim leaders were debating whether aliens had souls, while scientists were desperate to learn everything. When they returned to the assembly, Lyra made an offer that shocked everyone, saying she would remain on Earth as permanent ambassador and cultural bridge between the species, but, more than that, She would share Andromedan medical technology that could cure cancer and extend human life by hundreds of years, if humanity agreed to peace. The American president stood and asked what guarantee Earth had that the Andromedans would not simply conquer them once they had lowered their defenses. Lyra looked at Jake and made a decision that had no precedent in her people's history as she took his hand and announced, before the entire world, "I offer myself in marriage alliance to this human Jake Miller, binding our species together by blood and law, making any betrayal impossible under Andromedan honor codes." The assembly erupted in chaos, while Jake stood frozen as Lyra turned to him with those silver eyes full of hope and fear and whispered, "Please trust me." He realized she was not just offering a political arrangement but had found a way to save both their worlds while also following what their connected hearts wanted. Jake took both her hands and said in front of the whole world, "Hey, sweetie, if you are proposing, then my answer is yes," and she glowed bright purple. "Yes, darling," she replied and kissed him. And in that moment, the fear in the room changed to wonder as people saw that love could exist between species. The vote was called, and one by one nations agreed to provisional peace talks with conditions and safeguards, but the door was open and history had changed. Over the following weeks, Jake and Lyra became the most famous couple on Earth as they traveled between capitals, explaining the alliance and showing their genuine connection. Tom became their security chief, using his paranoid preparations to protect them from both human extremists and Andromedan traditionalists who opposed the match scientists, examined the medical technology Lyra provided, and confirmed it was real and could save millions of lives while engineers studied Andromedan energy systems. But the real change came when ordinary humans and Andromedans began to meet as more ambassadors arrived and cultural exchanges started happening. Children were especially quick to accept the tall blue visitors, and Lyra spent hours in schools teaching them about the universe beyond Earth's sky. Jake learned to speak Andromedan and discovered their art and music were based on mathematics, but when influenced by human emotion, created something entirely new. They established an embassy in Kansas on Jake's farm, which seemed fitting, since it was where first contact truly happened. And the wheat field became a landing pad. The wedding was planned for 6 months later to give both species time to adjust and would combine human and Andromedan traditions in ways never before imagined. Lyra's father visited Earth, personally breaking protocol because he wanted to meet the human who had saved his daughter and won her 3 hearts. The king was even taller than Lyra, with skin like polished sapphires, and he studied Jake with ancient eyes before speaking in carefully practiced English. "You are not what I expected, human Jake Miller. But then nothing about your species is what we expected. And perhaps that is why this alliance will succeed." He explained that in 10,000 years of space travel, the Andromedans had never found a species that challenged them to grow and change until humanity. Jake's farm was transformed into a blend of Earth and alien architecture, with crystalline structures growing from the soil alongside the traditional farmhouse. Lyra planted an Andromedan garden that grew plants which sang in harmonious frequencies and bore fruit that tasted like concentrated sunshine. But not everyone was happy about the changes, and protests grew violent in some places, with people claiming humanity was being corrupted or invaded. One night, extremists attacked the farm with military weapons they had somehow acquired, and Jake and Lyra had to defend their home together as they fought side by side. Jake realized this was their life now, standing between two worlds and protecting the bridge they had built with their love. When the attackers were defeated and arrested, Lyra healed their wounds, even though they had tried to kill her, because she said mercy was the first step to peace. The incident made global news, and support for the alliance grew as people saw Lyra's compassion and Jake's determination to protect both human and Andromedan lives. General Vox was tried on the Andromedan homeworld and exiled to a prison planet, but sent a message warning that other species would not be so peaceful. This sobered both worlds as they realized the alliance was not just about friendship but survival. In a universe with threats neither could face alone. The wedding day arrived with ships from 12 different star systems hovering over Kansas, while billions on Earth and beyond watched the first interspecies marriage ceremony. Jake stood at the altar they had built in the wheat field where Lyra had crashed, wearing a suit that incorporated Andromedan fabric that shifted like liquid starlight. Tom was his best man, still carrying concealed weapons out of habit while making jokes to keep Jake calm as they waited for the ceremony to begin. Music started as a fusion of Earth orchestras and Andromedan harmonics that created sounds no one had heard before, but everyone felt in their bones. Lyra appeared walking with her father, and she wore a dress made of crystallized light that showed her true form while honoring human traditions. Her 3 hearts were visible through the translucent material, each glowing a different color, representing life, thought, and soul beating in perfect synchronization. When she reached Jake, she took his hands, and through their connection, he felt her joy mixed with nervousness and deep love that transcended species or worlds. The ceremony was performed by both the UN Secretary General and an Andromedan High Priestess who spoke words in a dozen languages about unity and hope. They exchanged rings made from metal from Lyra's crashed ship and gold from Jake's family farm, fused together into something entirely new and symbolic. When they kissed, the sky erupted in a display from the alien ships that painted the clouds with colors humans had no names for while the crowd cheered. The reception was held in the new embassy building, where humans tried Andromedan food that tasted like memories and aliens learned to dance to Earth music. Jake's marine buddies taught Andromedan warriors how to play poker, while Lyra's sisters showed human women how to braid light into their hair. Tom gave a speech that started with how he always knew aliens were real and ended with tears as he called Jake and Lyra proof that love was universal as the sun set. Jake and Lyra snuck away from their own reception to sit on the porch of his old farmhouse where everything had started. She leaned against him and said, "I never imagined when I left my world that I would find something worth more than planets or empires or eternal life." Jake kissed her forehead and replied, "Hey, sweetie, you saved me too, because I was just existing until you crashed into my life and gave it meaning." "Yes, darling," she whispered, glowing purple in the darkness, and they sat watching Earth's sunset while Andromeda's stars began to appear above. 3 months after the wedding, Lyra discovered she was pregnant, which caused panic on both worlds, since no one knew if it was even possible. Scientists and doctors from both species monitored her constantly, but Jake refused to leave her side even when they wanted to quarantine her. The pregnancy progressed differently than either species expected, with the baby showing characteristics that seemed impossible by all known genetic science. Lyra needed both Earth minerals and Andromedan crystals to sustain the child, and Jake learned to sense what she needed through their telepathic bond. Tom moved into the farmhouse to help protect them as news of the hybrid pregnancy spread, and both supporters and opponents grew more extreme. Some humans saw the baby as an abomination, while others viewed it as the next step in evolution, and Andromedans were equally divided. Lyra's father stationed a warship in orbit over Kansas and made it clear that any threat to his daughter or grandchild would face the Empire's wrath. But he also sent teachers and healers to help Lyra through something no one had experienced before, as her body changed in ways that amazed everyone. Jake learned that human resilience and Andromedan adaptation were combining in their child, who would be something entirely new in the universe. On a spring morning 9 months later, their daughter was born with Jake's brown eyes and Lyra's color-shifting skin and only 2 hearts but stronger than either parent. They named her Amy Hope Miller, and she was perfect, even though she confused every scientist who examined her with abilities from both species and some entirely unique. She could touch someone and heal them like Lyra, but also had human intuition and creativity, and something else that made plants grow and technology respond. The birth was broadcast across the galaxy and became a symbol that different species could not just coexist but create something beautiful together. Amy grew faster than human children but slower than Andromedans, and by age 5 she was speaking 12 Earth languages and 3 alien ones. She could run through the wheat fields and leap 30 feet into the air, laughing as both human and Andromedan children tried to keep up. Tom became her godfather and taught her survival skills while spoiling her with toys and stories about how her parents saved 2 civilizations. Other mixed couples began to emerge as humans and Andromedans fell in love, and more hybrid children were born, each unique. But all bridges between worlds. Jake was appointed Earth's first ambassador to the Andromedan Empire, while Lyra became the permanent representative to the United Nations. They traveled between worlds with Amy, who felt at home on both Earth and Andromeda, and served as translator not just of language but of souls. 10 years after first contact, Earth had changed beyond recognition, with clean energy and medical miracles and humans traveling to distant stars. But the biggest change was in perspective, as humanity realized they were not alone, and not supreme, but part of something infinitely larger. Threats came from other species, who feared the human Andromedan alliance. But together they stood stronger than either could alone, proving unity. Worked, Jake and Lyra aged differently with him, growing older, faster. But Andromedan medicine gave them centuries together to watch Amy grow and change the universe on their 10th anniversary. They stood in the same wheat field where they met, and Jake said, "Hey, sweetie. Thank you for crashing into my world." Lyra glowed purple and pulled him close, saying, "Yes, darling. Thank you for saving mine in more ways than you will ever know, my love." Amy ran between them, a perfect blend of two worlds and the living proof that love, courage, and hope could overcome any distance between stars. The stars above them shone with infinite possibilities, and Earth and Andromeda faced them together, no longer alone in the vast darkness of space. Their story became legend on 1,000 worlds of how a humble farmer and an alien princess proved that humanity's greatest strength was its heart,